The 8th of May, 1945, arrived with bells ringing across Britain and people dancing in the streets of London. Victory in Europe. The war was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The nightmare that had begun 6 years earlier was finally ending. In Hut 8 at Bletchley Park, the celebrations were muted. The staff gathered for tea and stale biscuits, raising their cups in quiet toasts to colleagues and to the work they had done, and to the fact that they had survived. But there was little joy in it. They were too exhausted, too hollowed out by years of pressure and secrecy and impossible choices. Margaret stood at her desk, looking at the final batch of German naval intercepts that would ever be processed in this room. The messages were confused, contradictory, revealing the chaos as the German command structure collapsed. There was no one left to coordinate U-boat operations. The submarines themselves were surfacing and surrendering too. Allied vessels are scuttling themselves in port rather than face capture. For years and 2 months she had spent in this place. 1,519 days of breaking codes and analyzing patterns and racing against time. She had personally contributed to the decryption of over 9,000 German naval messages. And the cumulative intelligence from Bletchley Park's naval section was estimated to have saved between 10,000 and 14,000 Allied ships from destruction. 10,000 ships, tens of thousands of sailors, millions of tons of supplies. The difference between victory and starvation, between survival and surrender. She would never be allowed to speak of it. Hugh Alexander addressed the assembled staff that afternoon, his voice rough with emotion. What you have accomplished here will not be recognized, cannot be acknowledged, must never be discussed. The Official Secrets Act that you signed when you arrived remains in force indefinitely. The work we did here is classified at the highest possible level and will remain so for decades. You will return to your civilian lives, and you will tell no one what you did during the war. Not your families, not your friends, not your future children. You will take this secret to your graves, and the only people who will ever know what you accomplished are standing in this room right now. He paused, his eyes moving across the faces of the cryptanalysts who had fought this invisible war.
Ow.
History will not record your names. There will be no medals, no public recognition, no monuments to your sacrifice. But know this, you changed the course of human history. Without the intelligence produced in these huts, Britain would have starved and the war would have been lost. You are the reason Allied convoys made it across the Atlantic. You are the reason the invasion of Europe was possible. You are the reason the Nazi regime was defeated. And even though the world will never know it, I know it, and you know it, and that will have to be enough. The staff dispersed quietly after the speech. There would be an official shutdown over the coming weeks. Equipment would be destroyed or locked away. Documents would be burned or classified into oblivion. The temporary wooden huts that had housed the most important secret of the war would be dismantled or repurposed for mundane peacetime activities. Bletchley Park itself would fade into obscurity, known only as some minor government communications facility that had played a negligible role in the war effort. Catherine found Margaret standing outside Hut 8 one final time, looking at the building that had consumed for years of her life. "What will you do now?" Catherine asked. "Return to teaching, I suppose." Bedford College survived the bombing. They will need mathematics lecturers for all the men returning from service who want to complete their degrees. Margaret's voice was flat, emotionless. "What about you? Get married, have children, pretend I spent the war doing nothing more interesting than knitting socks for soldiers." Catherine laughed bitterly. "My fiancé thinks I worked in the supply department of the Admiralty. He has no idea I spent the war breaking German codes. He will never know that the woman he marries helped sink dozens of U-boats. I will spend the rest of my life lying to the person I love most about the most important thing I ever did." They stood in silence for a while, two young women who had aged decades in 4 years, who carried secrets that would outlive them. "Do you think it was worth it?" Margaret asked quietly. "What we did here? The lives we saved versus the lives we chose not to save? The secrets we will carry forever?" Catherine considered the question carefully. "I think we did the only thing we could do. Fought the war we were given with the weapons we had. Mathematics and statistics instead of guns and bombs. It was brutal in its own way, but it was necessary." She turned to look at Margaret. "You saved 10,000 ships, Margaret. You personally contributed to breaks that prevented catastrophic losses. That matters, even if no one ever knows you did it. Margaret wanted to believe that. She wanted to feel pride in her accomplishments. But all she felt was tired. So tired she could barely stand. The subsequent weeks were disorienting. Margaret returned to London to find her flat had been requisitioned during the war and was now occupied by someone else. She stayed with distant relatives while searching for new accommodation, and every conversation was an exercise in careful evasion. What did you do during the war? Where were you stationed? Did you see any action? Clerical work for the government? Somewhere in the countryside? Nothing interesting. The lies came easily after 4 years of practice. She visited James, who had married during the war and was now working as a school administrator in Surrey. His war had ended at Dunkirk. His left arm remained partially disabled, but he seemed content in a way that Margaret envied. He had fought his battles openly in daylight, where friends and enemies were clearly distinguishable. He bore no guilt for secret decisions about which intelligence to use and which to withhold. "You never talk about your war work," he observed during one visit. "Even now that it is over, you avoid the subject completely." "There is nothing to talk about," she said. "I filed papers and typed reports. It was desperately dull." He did not believe her. She could see that in his eyes. But he did not press the issue. Perhaps he had his own war secrets, things he could not speak of from Dunkirk or afterward. Perhaps everyone who had lived through the war carried silent burdens. Bedford College welcomed her back with enthusiasm. They needed experienced instructors, and her pre-war academic credentials were solid. She resumed teaching probability theory and statistics to students who had no idea their lecturer had spent the war applying those same theories to matters of life and death. The work was mind-numbingly simple after Bletchley Park, teaching undergraduates. Basic frequency analysis felt like explaining addition to university students. But it was safe, and it was normal. And Margaret clung to normal as if it were a life raft. She did not marry. Several men expressed interest over the years, but Margaret could never fully connect with anyone who had not shared the particular crucible of wartime code-breaking. How could she explain the nightmares to someone who did not know their cause? How could she share her life with someone when the most important part of that life was forbidden territory? She maintained occasional contact with Catherine and a few others from Bletchley Park. They met for tea in London once or twice a year. Careful conversations in public places where they discussed everything except the work. It was like being members of an exclusive club that could never acknowledge its own existence. The Official Secrets Act hung over them like a sword. There were occasional rumors of prosecutions against people who had spoken carelessly about classified war work. The message was clear. Silence was not optional. It was mandatory and enforced. Years passed. The war faded from immediate memory into history. Britain recovered slowly from the devastation. The empire contracted. The world divided into Cold War camps of East and West, and the secret of Bletchley Park remained buried in classified files that almost no one could access. In 1974, nearly 30 years after the war's end, the British government finally declassified some information about the code-breaking operations at Bletchley Park. The revelations were stunning to historians and the public. The unbreakable Enigma cipher had been broken. The Germans had been fighting a war while their enemies could read their most secret communications. The entire strategic situation had been influenced by intelligence whose source was concealed for 3 decades. Margaret was 65 years old when the first revelations became public. She read the newspaper articles with mixed feelings. Relief that the secret could finally be acknowledged. Bitterness that the recognition came so late. After many of her colleagues had died, never being able to speak of their accomplishments, it's anxiety that even now, the full truth would remain classified for political reasons. A journalist tracked her down somehow, requesting an interview about her time at Bletchley Park. Margaret declined. Even with partial declassification, specific operational details remained restricted. And more fundamentally, she was not ready to speak. The weight of silence had become such a part of her that breaking it felt like dismantling her own identity. But others were speaking. Alan Turing's contributions were finally being acknowledged, though he had died in 1954 without ever receiving public recognition for his work. Hugh Alexander wrote carefully worded memoirs that revealed some details while protecting others. The story of Bletchley Park began to emerge piece by piece. A mosaic assembled from fragments that individuals were finally permitted to share. In 1991, at age 72, Margaret finally agreed to speak to an oral historian documenting the experiences of women cryptanalysts. The interview took place in her small Cambridge flat, surrounded by mathematics, textbooks, and academic papers that represented her public career. "What was it like?" the historian asked, "being a young woman thrust into that environment? Did you feel the weight of what you were doing?" Margaret considered the question for a long time before answering. "Every day," she said finally. "Every single day." We knew the statistics. We knew that each broken message might save hundreds of lives, and each failure might cost hundreds more. That knowledge never left you, never let you rest properly, never allowed you to be anything other than absolutely focused on the work. Do you believe the secrecy was necessary? During the war? Absolutely. Afterward? Margaret shook her head. "I think it went on too long." People who did extraordinary things for their country were forced to live as if they had done nothing at all. Colleagues died without their families ever knowing what they had accomplished. That was cruel, though perhaps necessarily cruel. Intelligence sources must be protected even decades after their usefulness has ended. What do you want people to remember about Bletchley Park? Margaret looked out her window at the Cambridge streets, thinking about the frightened 22-year-old who had boarded a train to an unknown destination in 1941. That mathematics can be a weapon as powerful as any gun or bomb. That abstract thought can save lives on a massive scale. That women were essential to the war effort in ways that went far beyond nursing and factory work. And that the cost of secrecy is borne most heavily by those who must keep it, who must live with knowing they'd changed history while being forbidden to speak of it. She died in 1998 at the age of 79, having finally lived long enough to see Bletchley Park properly recognized as a historic site and museum. Her obituary in the Times mentioned her work there in a single paragraph, noting that she had been a cryptanalyst who contributed to breaking German naval codes. It was accurate, but inadequate, a footnote to a life that had been defined by work that remained largely unacknowledged. At her memorial service, 3 elderly women and 2 elderly men attended whom the family did not recognize. They stood together quietly, saying little but staying until everyone else had left. They were the last surviving members of Hut 8, who had worked alongside Margaret during the war. "She was brilliant," one of the women said to Margaret's niece. "Absolutely brilliant. The intelligence community owes her a debt that can never be fully repaid." "What exactly did she do?" the niece asked. "She never spoke about it, not even after the declassification." The woman smiled sadly. "She saved 10,000 ships. And she carried that burden silently for the rest of her life, because that was what her country asked of her." It was only in the 21st century that the full scope of Bletchley Park's achievements became widely known. Historians with access to newly declassified documents could finally assemble the complete picture. The statistical analysis revealed what the cryptanalysts had always known but could never say. Breaking Enigma had shortened the war by years and saved millions of lives. Margaret Howard's specific contributions were documented in those files. Her work on shark cryptanalysis, her discovery of message-length patterns, or training of subsequent generations of cryptanalysts, her participation in the selection meetings that decided which intelligence to act upon and which to withhold. She had indeed helped save approximately 10,000 Allied merchant ships from U-boat attack through her contributions to the naval intelligence effort. It was not hyperbole or estimation. The numbers were carefully calculated by analysts who studied convoy routes, U-boat positions, and the correlation between successful decryption and successful convoy routing. 10,000 ships. The young woman who had been terrified in room 40 of the Foreign Office had gone on to become one of the most effective intelligence analysts of the war, and she had done it while carrying secrets that would have destroyed her if she had spoken them. That did damage her in ways that never fully healed. That marked her forever as someone who had seen and done things that could not be shared. The legacy of Bletchley Park is complex. It represents human ingenuity at its finest, the application of pure mathematics to practical problems of existential importance. It demonstrates that intellectual warfare can be as decisive as physical combat. It proved that women were fully capable of performing the most demanding analytical work, though that lesson had to be learned repeatedly in subsequent decades. But it also represents the cost of secrecy, the psychological burden carried by thousands of people who could never speak of their accomplishments. The families who never knew why their loved ones seemed damaged by a war they had supposedly spent in safe, boring administrative positions. The recognition delayed for decades until many of those who deserved it were dead. Margaret Howard was one of thousands who fought that secret war. Her story was not unique. Many women like her spent their youth breaking codes and analyzing patterns and making impossible decisions about life and death. Most of them returned to conventional lives afterward, carrying their secrets silently until declassification allowed partial acknowledgement. The girl who saved 10,000 ships became the woman who taught probability theory to undergraduates and lived quietly and died with her secrets mostly intact. It is an ending that feels incomplete, unsatisfying, inadequate to the magnitude of what she accomplished. But perhaps that is the point. War creates heroes who can never be acknowledged, sacrifices that can never be fully known, victories that must remain secret. Margaret Howard and her colleagues at Bletchley Park fought and won a critical battle of World War II, and the price of that victory was a lifetime of silence. They paid that price willingly. They did what their country needed, kept the secrets they were required to keep, and lived with the consequences. And now, decades after their war ended, we can finally say what they could never say themselves. They changed the world. They saved countless lives. They made victory possible. And they did it knowing they would never receive credit, never be thanked, never be allowed to take pride in their accomplishments. That is perhaps the greatest sacrifice of all.